Just give people a couple more minutes, Cam. I can see people are still joining.
Yeah, very good. And everyone, thank you for joining the webinar on practical steps for the community housing sector. I'd also like to thank Wendy Hayhurst and the Community Housing Industry Association for the help and support in coordinating this session. I think we have a number of providers as well as representatives from government today, so it's really good to see we have a broad representation from across the sector for this next hour. And so before I take you through the agenda, I'd just like to acknowledge that today's meeting will be held on the lands of our traditional owners. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, both past, present and emerging, and also pay my respects to elders and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are present on today's call. So if we just move to the agenda for today's session. Thank you. Today we'll begin with Richard Mills, our EY leader for affordable and social housing, to give a snapshot of the COVID-19 related key risks to providers in the sector. We'll then move to talk about some key elements around business continuity as well as financial management. I'll take you through that. My name's Cameron Bird. I'm a Health and Human Services partner at EY. Also talk about government stimulus and support. Richard Featherby, a Associate Director in our Infrastructure Advisory team, will run through that. And Richard will then finish up talking about protecting wellbeing. While there's a lot of risks and factors to consider, wellbeing for us in this time is also a very important factor. And then we'll finish with some Q&A. We're also joined by Asher Moore, a director with our real estate advisory services team, who I know many of you have engaged with. So let's kick off on the first agenda item. I'll throw to you, Rich.
Thanks, Cam, and thanks to everyone who's taken the time to dial into the session today. So we've been running these sessions for a bunch of different organisations in the not-for-profit space, and one of the challenges we've had in putting this one together is just how diverse the community housing sector is. It's fair to say that providers are going to be feeling very different pressures depending on their size, their tenant base, where they're located, and their property portfolio. So we know this, and we know that not all of the issues that we're describing on this slide and in the rest of this presentation are going to be relevant to all of you. I think we need to look at these as potential risks, which may be materialising for some providers more than for others. But one thing that is common to most housing providers, at least, is that you tend to operate on relatively thin operating margins. In fact, I think the majority of community housing providers in the NERSH, at least, which is the data I have an operating cash flow adequacy ratio which is below 1.2. So providers are great at taking a relatively stable but revenue-constrained business and operating that incredibly efficiently. But what happens when an event like COVID comes around that destabilizes that? It only takes a relatively contained drop in revenue or a relatively contained increase in operating costs for organisations to really start to feel the pinch. So from our discussions with funders, providers and regulators, we're seeing a few key risks to the sector. You guys are living through these, so you'll be more familiar with them than we are. So I won't take up too much of your time going through them in detail. But I think it is helpful to at least categorise those risks, as it helps and flows into the rest of the discussion, which we're going to have in the rest of this webinar, on how you can best plan your organisation's response to them. So the first category here is revenue risk. And I mean, I think we need to sort of acknowledge that the government has done an enormous amount here to stand behind the incomes of its citizens and to ensure that tenants can continue to pay rent. But despite those programs, we're still seeing some key risks around rental revenue. The first is that despite the measures which have been put in place, not all tenants who lose wage income are going to be eligible for JobKeeper. That could be either because they've already lost their jobs and their employers aren't taking them back on, because they were casuals, or because perhaps they were working cash in hand. It may be a minority that are going to miss out, but it could still hurt, particularly in the context, I think, of affordable housing. The second is that where tenants are receiving the increased job seeker payment, this won't count towards assessable income, or at least that's what community housing providers have agreed with state governments in most states we're looking at. So in social housing, this means that where wage income has been lost but has been made up for by an increased job seeker payment, rents may still come down. And where providers, as many do, profile their tenant portfolios to include some higher income cross-subsidising lower income households, this could cause real pain. The third risk is that there are concerns in the sector and in government that when faced with an uncertain future and a constantly evolving and confused policy landscape, tenants who haven't lost any income may still be choosing to cancel their automatic deductions and to withhold rent. Essentially, this comes down to tenants preferring to hold on to their cash when their futures are so uncertain and evictions seem relatively unlikely. This may actually be a bigger risk than the other two I've outlined, because it's actually quite hard to predict how widespread it could manifest itself. You can't quantify that because it relies ultimately on human behaviour. There's also risks around increased vacancy days, turnarounds being more complicated to effect in the current environment. And of course, this is all happening against a backdrop where, in some states at least, the 6 monthly rent reviews providers have budgeted for have been deferred. So most of these risks are perhaps relatively marginal, but the point is that it only takes a relatively marginal drop in revenue for an already constrained operating margin to be put under a lot of pressure. The second category here is around cost, and the biggest risk here is that community housing providers are relatively constrained in their ability to reduce their cost base in a lockdown environment. So unlike some other businesses, at the end of the day, you still have to continue to provide a roof over people's heads, and you've got to do that safely. So life cycle can be deferred, and reactive maintenance can, reactive maintenance for the most part is still going to need to be provided. And there's a risk that this is more complex and more expensive to provide in a COVID environment. Again, it's also worth noting that this is taking place against what was expected to be a background of rising costs anyway, in particular around insurance. The third risk category that we're seeing is around capital, and this is going to impact some providers more than others. But although base interest rates have, of course, been falling dramatically, margins have been rising, and we expect that lenders will be tightening borrowing covenants in this environment. So there are definitely still challenges at the moment to refinancing, particularly property-backed loans, in an environment where there's a lot of uncertainty around valuations. The fourth risk category is around the regulatory regime and funding contracts. So providers have to report against an array of measures, but on top of this, they may be reporting to funders under a range of different funding arrangements at the same time. And some of those funding arrangements may be measuring providers on tighter measures than the regulation itself. So there's a risk that COVID-related operating constraints can place those providers in breach of those covenants or those measures or those reporting measures. And this could, of course, have reputational effects, but it can also have direct funding-related consequences in some circumstances. Lastly, we've got a risk here around tenants, and this is a hugely important one. I think there's a real potential for negative outcomes to tenants if the usual wraparound supports and services can't be provided, or if they can be provided but can only be provided in a sort of scaled down or in a virtual setup. And aside from the human tragedy there, there's a bottom line in the context of a webinar around financial sustainability. There's a bottom line impact to providers in terms of negative exits, bad debts, and increased maintenance. I might just ask, there's a little bit of noise interference in the background there. If you're listening in, can I ask that you go on mute just to improve the sound quality? So the last thing I'd like to say about the risks is that with the curve flattening across all states, there does seem to be some light now at the end of the tunnel. And it's crucial that providers turn their attention not only to getting through the now, but starting to plan for the beyond. we may be coming out into a recession, possibly a prolonged recession, and that means a lot of things. It could mean increased demand for social and affordable housing with more people in housing stress. That's a likely outcome, perhaps. But it could also mean that government stimulus and a soft housing market combine to lead to an opportunity to meet that demand with a surge in new supply. We'll talk a bit more about that further in this webinar, but providers should really be starting to plan now to take advantage of those potential opportunities. So if we could move on to the next slide. For the rest of the session today, we're going to be looking at some practical steps that providers can take to get in front of the risks we've discussed and to create some resilience in their business and start to plan for the road out to recovery. We'll go into some detail later in the session on how you can test and evaluate your business continuity plan and update it where required, and how you can ensure you're managing your cash effectively during this period, and how you can ensure you're benefiting from the various supports government has in place. But before going into that, I think it's helpful to start by looking at your response plan against 4 key domains. The first is to put people's safety first, and this means ensuring that you have developed operating strategies and protocols which ensure the safety of your staff. It also means, of course, ensuring that your tenants are safe and that your accommodation is being provided in a COVID-safe way, particularly in the case of high-risk accommodation like boarding houses and so forth. Those operational responses aren't really the focus of what we're covering in this webinar, but I know there's a wealth of materials out there being published by government and the peaks to support with this as well. But lastly, I think there's an element of tenant safety which goes beyond sort of COVID directly related concerns and which relies on some level of support and services continuing to be provided to tenants while they're in lockdown. So what I'm talking about there is working with service providers to identify priority areas, like, for example, domestic violence, and ensuring an appropriate level of service can continue to be provided safely during lockdown. The second domain there is around communication with stakeholders. And the key thing here, I mean, what this means is ensuring that you have a sophisticated and a multifaceted communication strategy with your tenants, which ensures you're reaching everyone. This is important because it goes to the effectiveness of your safety measures, but also, of course, to the effectiveness of your rent recovery measures, and to ensuring that you and your tenants are aware of and applying for all government supports that can help you through this period. It also means ensuring your forecasts are up to date and are robust, so you can engage early with funders and with regulators around potential issues, and get them on board and get their support. Lastly, workforce. So I think ensuring your workforce is as effective as it can be done through transparency and through promoting connectivity in your communications. The third domain here is around reshaping your strategy to maintain business continuity. And really this just comes down to maximizing your rent recovery while deferring or avoiding costs wherever you can. So you need to be minimizing vacant days and managing your rental recovery so that you're recovering appropriately, subject of course to hardship policies. Again, your strategy here will be multifaceted, and aside from business as usual active management of rent recovery, things to consider are tenant communications and education really around evictions rights and the risks of building up rental arrears during this period, and how that's a lose-lose situation for both tenants and providers. Potentially leveraging the sector's advocacy for additional policy support in particular problem areas. So what I mean by this, or an example at least that I have in my mind when I say this, is that there is a potential opportunity here to revisit, perhaps in a limited way, the right to cancel automatic rent deductions in scenarios where you're refraining from eviction for rental arrears. And those sort of policy interventions need to be explored and where appropriate, advocated for. On the cost side, well, you'll already be deferring life cycle and reducing non-essential maintenance and other services, but are there opportunities to revisit fixed cost contracts for maintenance, insurance, or potentially lease arrangements? And of course, the other big cost category is workforce. And I think the important thing here is to identify a clear escalation path in cost reduction, which minimizes the risk that any redundancies become necessary. So, for example, this could include ensuring existing leave bookings are honoured, reassigning staff to new projects, bringing forward training, requiring mandatory leave, and finally, where unavoidable, reducing hours and potentially, if necessary, redundancies. Transparency around decision making and clear communication of these processes will ensure staff are supportive of these measures. The last domain here is about building resilience and starting to prepare for the road out. And at a tactical level, this involves starting to plan logistically for resuming full operations. But it's also important to think about this from a strategic level, and that involves consideration of what the post-COVID environment might look like. Particular risks, I think, that need to be considered in that context are that there is a disconnect between how tenant incomes recover and how government supports are scaled back, that doesn't happen in lockstep, and what contingency planning is required at a provider level to sort of navigate that risk. More broadly, I think a prolonged recession could mean that tenant income profiles are changed into the medium and possibly even the long term. And given how central rent assumptions are for different tenant cohorts to providers' businesses, reassessing those rental assumptions in that context against different scenarios is important. I also spoke earlier about how we might see an uptick of people in housing stress and more people on waiting lists, but that at the same time, we might expect to see significant government stimulus in this area, and at the same time, a soft housing market. And I think the soft housing market could lead to opportunities for providers in deals with developers, particularly in projects which are being fast-tracked through planning law changes, which are being announced in a number of states now, and so are coming to market in what wouldn't normally be ideal market conditions for developers. There are real opportunities there, I think, for tying up with developers and creating opportunities for developing social and affordable housing at attractive rates. The last thing I'll say on building resilience and preparing for recovery is that shocks will happen again. So it's worth thinking about how you are likely to come out of this one. What were your pressure points and how you could insulate against those better next time round. And that involves considering what options you have in the context of your business and your sector and your purpose for diversifying revenue and spreading your cost base, and potentially how closer partnerships and tie-ups with other organisations could help fill some of those gaps you've identified. So I'll hand over to Cam now, and we're going to take a more detailed look at how you can test, evaluate and update your business continuity plan and how you're managing your cash effectively.
Thanks, Richard. So as you can see on this slide, what it captures is what we identify as some of the key areas that constitute a business continuity plan. And certainly speaking to a number of organisations, we realise that business continuity plans aren't something that are tabled at every board meeting, and certainly they don't capture necessarily the response of organisations to a pandemic event. So certainly I wouldn't be concerned necessarily if you don't have an extensive plan. And so what I thought I'd do is just outline some of the practical steps that you can take both to your own organisation and to your boards just to ensure that you're covering off on some of the key categories to maintain your operations. So in terms of a risk plan, a lot of us maintain risk registers for our organisations. What are the events? What are the consequences? How severe are they? I think certainly, we think if we cast our minds back to say five weeks ago, when the isolation measures were adopted, it was a very stressful time for everyone. There was a need. It almost felt like the ground was moving beneath our feet on a daily basis, and we had to make a lot of decisions, and a lot of them quickly. Spending some time looking forward, now that we're past this and the curve has flattened, it has given us a chance to do some more planning. What are the key risks we foresee over the next 4 weeks, 8 weeks, and beyond? What does it mean for us, and how will we react to that? Business impact analysis. What will be the impact of these risks or events on our business? Your operations well, and certainly you're in the best position to identify what the impacts are going to be. So therefore, you are in the best position to determine how you can handle that. What's your response plan in terms of both the actual crises when it occurred? There were a lot of crisis management teams were set up. Now when we think about our risks, we're probably thinking about more things that affect ongoing continuation of our business. How are we going to react to that? What's our plan to respond? What resources? Who will we communicate to? Richard mentioned communication. Just consistent, regular communication to our stakeholders, we've found, is a very good mechanism to ensure that your organisation feels like it's on the right track, but also your key stakeholders are well informed. Recovery plan. I think this is a really good point to touch on for a little while. Again, 4 weeks ago, we were very focused on risks, impact, what's the incident response. And recovery wasn't a big emphasis, but in the last few weeks, recovery has become a big focus, because we've, fortunately, through the measures of government around isolation, the health-related risk, and this ultimately, it's important for us to remind ourselves this is a health crisis. The health-related risks are lower right now relative to previous weeks. We're more informed. We've been practicing isolation for a while, both in our private lives, but also in business. And so now's a good time to think about, what does recovery look like? Look at your organisation's practices, and as we come out of isolation measures, what's the new normal that you can expect that is different from the past, and what might you adopt, therefore, as a change, whether it's around tenancy management, facilities maintenance, and other aspects of your business. And then test, evaluate, and update. The cycle for this kind of business continuity plan would have been quite long in the past, but that test and evaluation cycle, this is something it is normal to continually evaluate whether or not the plan you had in place for your organisation, was the right one. I think we're all purpose-driven organisations, and certainly the people who participated today. And so you've drawn out what your strategy and what your approach is to run your day-to-day business, to acknowledge that some things that you've changed about your operations may not be right, and you might want to change them again. That's okay, I think. And so continuous testing, evaluating, and updating your plan, certainly in today's environment, is very much a normal practice. Might just move to the next slide, please. So I think one aspect we can all agree, while certainly management of our workforce, management of tenants, and other stakeholders are important, financial management is definitely a key element to sustain your business as you're moving through. And from organisations like yourselves and other for-purpose organisations, we've identified 4 categories to describe just some key practical tips around financial management of your business. And so that's cash management, government stimulus, spend reduction, and debt facilities. So in terms of cash management, ultimately maintaining working capital, maintaining cash levels for your operations is really important. And certainly that first point there around your rental recovery and refining your communication strategy and the processes you undertake to recover your rent on a timely basis is definitely key during this time. Do cash flow forecasting, a kind of typical forecast horizon for businesses who might be a bit uncertain about operations is 13 weeks, but certainly in the nature of your operations, maybe go further out than that. But certainly do continuous forecasting of your cash flows and test against some of those risk scenarios. And then finally, we acknowledge there's regulatory and contractual benchmarks that you need to fulfill, and that might have a financial impact on you in an environment where you're unable to fulfill. So consider those factors as you go forward. Government stimulus, there's been heavy government stimulus across the broader economy. Identify those packages which are relevant to you. Contact your relevant government agencies and have conversations. Contact your financial institutions. They're very much incentivised to understand the available government stimulus measures, and they're a very good source of knowledge for yourself. You don't have to do this all on your own. Work with your finance teams and your accountants. We definitely want to focus on business itself, but supporting your finance teams are really important. And ensuring your tenants have the right information and support to avail themselves of government payments is obviously a key specific point for you to consider. Spend reduction, consider all expenditure that you don't think is critical. If something isn't considered non-essential expenditure, consider cancelling, reducing or deferring your non-essential expenditure. Also consider delegation policies around expenditure levels, and also look at your capital expenditure. You might have capital projects that are government funded, and you would probably want to continue those, but there might be special capital projects that you've decided to deploy, and if there's an opportunity to defer or adjust milestone payments, do so. So finally, around debt facilities, we all have different approaches in terms of level of debt finance, but certainly look at your capacity to raise certainly liquidity through existing facilities. Talk to your financial institutions early. Confirm what banking arrangements are actually in place with your bank, and also consider reputable financial providers around alternative forms of financial products, because there are a number that come out. So there's some practical tips around financial management of your business. I'll now throw to Richard Featherby, who will talk about government supports in more detail.
Richard Featherby, just before you start, just for the benefit of people who may have joined late as well, just a reminder, there will be a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. If you have questions, please submit them as you go using the Zoom group chat function, and then we'll address those at the end. Thank you.
Okay, look, I think it's worth emphasising at this point that the government have never seen a condition like this. There's never been a situation where an economy has moved so quickly towards a recession, and where the usual levers that governments pull in recessions don't work or aren't really available. And so both state and federal governments are in an extremely reactive position with respect to the COVID issue. None of the policies that they have address this, and none of the usual processes they follow through to address this either. So we expect there to be an incredibly volatile process as the states and the federal government assess what are the largest risks to both financial and social environments around the country. So it is certainly worthwhile considering monitoring what the states and federal government are saying about initiatives and how they might adjust those initiatives as they come out. For example, only this morning, the Queensland government made a sudden change to its rental eviction bill to still make rental non-payment a debt, because the older version that they proposed to pass called into question whether in fact rental arrears were a debt that was collectible. So be aware that these things will change and that they will change rapidly. But there is also an opportunity to communicate with governments on the problems that you see emerging in the basis of the people that you serve. Because you being on the ground will see these problems emerge before governments do, and you will have the opportunity to call them into practice and say, these are the emerging elements that we need help with. But I think what I'll just quickly do is to run through what the key elements are and just relating them to what state governments and federal governments have the power to do. So the federal government has taken the lead in terms of an overall overarching process to maintain employment with the JobKeeper scheme and the extension to the job seeker payments, so that businesses are incentivized to keep staff employed, even if their revenue is not flowing, and people who are out of work have sufficient funds to be able to support themselves during this time period. But the other elements that the federal government controls are the tax system. And so whenever there's a recessionary pressure, then they do go to the standard types of elements, which are additional depreciation deductions, additional investment write-offs, and concessions on pay-as-you-go and BAS payments. So those tax-based initiatives, of course, aren't that much use to NGOs who don't have accessible bases anyway. So really what you're looking at are making sure that your tenants access as much as they can of the job seeker, and that where appropriate, you yourself access the JobKeeper subsidy to make sure that you can keep as many of your staff employed as possible for the uptick that will occur when we come out of the lockdown. If we look at the states, you can see that the states are pulling the levers that they have access to. They don't have as large a financial base as the federal government, and they don't control some of the major policies through which payments can be made. So at the moment, they are largely adjusting their fee basis. So almost all the states have put in place payroll tax concessions. Almost all the states have put in place rental rebates where you are tenants in their properties. Many of the states are moving to waive license and concession fees that are charged to small businesses or medium businesses in terms of specialists, so that again, those fee imposts don't have to be paid during the lockdown and the COVID period. And a lot of them are creating funds in which low interest or no interest loans are available to businesses to sustain themselves during this period. And those loans are available to both for-profit companies and NGOs as well. So again, certainly those funds are worth checking to see if you would qualify for the loans and on whether they would be interest or interest-free depending upon your status. We're also seeing some direct stimulatory elements responding to some of the problems that are arising. So, for example, the ACT has introduced a $7 million payment to NGOs which are servicing the most vulnerable to make sure that those services still go out. There's Tasmania and Queensland have introduced specific mental health provision funding, so that again, elements that are providing services to those in those fields have access to additional funds, since again, those types of problems are likely to be exacerbated during lockdowns and during areas where normal types of service provision sometimes can't occur. It's also worth noting that all the states and territories have agreed to implement the federal rental eviction ban process. Again, the federal government met with all the state governments as part of that process, and obviously the federal government can't change tenancy rules and laws, they're all state-based. So the states were tasked with implementing that ban. They've chosen different ways to do it. Some of the states have just put in place a short-term abeyance for those elements while they see what happens. Other states, such as Queensland and WA, have introduced direct legislation to implement those eviction ban processes. The versions that I have seen so far do not remove the obligation to pay rental. That was the late change to Queensland. While they can't evict you for non-payment of rent due to loss of revenue during the COVID process, the rent still accrues. So it still has to be paid out the other end. So again, we have this situation where, yes, there are restrictions on tenants being removed from their place of rent if they can't pay the rent, but they're still going to be accruing that debt when it comes to the end of that eviction mandatory process. We're also seeing governments pass legislation which says if a tenancy ends during that time process, it continues on a month-to-month basis, so that landlords can't completely remove a tenancy if it ends naturally during this type of period. So again, there will be potentially a large number of rental processes where there is no rental income, but there is no way for the landlord to replace or remove the tenant solely on non-payment of rental. Evictions are still available for other reasons, if tenants damage the property, or there are other elements which transgress landlord transmitted rental agreements. It is simply unable to pay rental due to loss of income that most of those legislation addresses. We're also seeing a number of land tax initiatives go out. Some of those have been directly tied to rental payments, so that some entities can access land tax reductions, provided they pass that on, as a rental reduction, or an element of it as a rental reduction. But there is obviously, apart from the payroll tax and the evictions, there's a very wide range of responses, and we expect that very wide range of responses to continue as the state governments deal with the actual issues that arise peculiar to their state economies and peculiar to the social conditions that apply in those areas. So again, it is certainly worthwhile monitoring those elements. All the states have a single web page which lists all the majorities of all their initiatives and what they're proposing and who is eligible. So it is certainly worthwhile monitoring those as we go further. It's also worth noting that the health issue is being dealt quite quickly, quite efficiently. We have no idea how effectively these elements will do when we come out and look at the recession conditions that are applying. So we still yet have no idea as to the scope and the size of the economic issue that the states and the federal government are going to have to address. So again, we need to be ourselves monitoring how those elements affect us and ensuring that we communicate where the problems are arising to regulators and to state governments. I'll now pass back to Richard Mills.
Thanks, Richard. So I think we just wanted to end with the recognition that financial viability can't be looked at in isolation, and it's only one part of the broader well-being of the organisation. And those organisations that come out of this crisis stronger are those which, at the same time as they secure their finances, have managed to preserve their sense of purpose, protect the health and well-being of their staff, and have managed to navigate this transition to a virtual environment while preserving a sense of cohesion and connectivity within their teams. So there are all sorts of things you can be doing here, but really I think the important takeaway is that understanding the risks that your organisation faces during this period includes understanding the psychosocial risk profile of your workforce, which is specific to your operating context. So your strategies to manage financial and operating risks need to include as well strategies and initiatives for addressing those psychosocial needs. And depending on your context, this could include targeted initiatives such as the ones we've listed here around cognitive agility, anxiety, sleep and fatigue, diet, exercise, financial well-being, and social interaction, you'll need to track and evaluate what's working for you and what's effective as you go, and no doubt adjust and fine-tune. We're all in new territory with a lot of this stuff, but it's worth recognizing that this should be, I think, as much a part of your risk planning as your financial bottom line. So we've got some time now to take some Q&A. You can either just unmute yourselves and ask us a question, or if you prefer to submit it via the chat function, that works as well. Are there any questions from the audience on anything we've covered today? I might kick us off. I've got a question for Richard. So, one of the risks that I talked about at the start of the session was around tenants misunderstanding perhaps what the position is on what was originally communicated by government as the evictions moratorium, and electing not to pay their rent because they saw the risk of eviction as unlikely, or the likelihood of eviction as unlikely. And that may still be actually a fair conclusion for tenants to draw, given the full purpose nature of their landlords and so forth. But from a legislative point of view, what are you seeing in the way that states are bringing this into their state, bringing this into legislation? What's the test before you are prevented from evicting a tenant?
Again, the legislation, well, first of all, almost all the ministers involved in each of the states and the federal government have said you should pay rent if you can. This is not an excuse not to pay rent. So there's a clear expectation that those who can pay rent will, and that this is not simply an excuse for a rental holiday. The test that, and I haven't seen the schedule for legislation, but the test that is described in the descriptions is that you must be able to demonstrate significant financial hardcoming as a result of the COVID-19 lockdown, is the way it's usually framed. In some way, it's a loss of unemployment, but still it is all tied to demonstrating that you have lost capacity to pay the rental. It's not simply a blanket moratorium which says you can't knock people out if they don't pay their rent. It is, you must be able to demonstrate that rental loss is related somehow to what's going on. That is the way it's been couched in the descriptions of the legislation that I've seen.
Which is interesting, because it's different perhaps from how it was originally messaged and interpreted by the man on the street.
Again, I think there's been a significant discussion between landlord organisations and tenant organisations about what the appropriate balance is between those elements in actually creating legislation. Because obviously legislation has a whole series of interaction effects, everything else, so that I think there's been a lot of discussion over how they can do that fairly.
So if I don't get a question from the audience soon, I might turn the tables on you and ask you a question. What are people in the audience seeing as the key challenges to them? Have we hit the mark in terms of what you think the key risks are that you've been facing in this period? Are there other risks that we haven't thought of? I'd be interested to hear as well from people on the tenant risks that we mentioned, and whether they are seeing that it is more challenging and potentially tenants are having more negative outcomes as a result of constrained ability to deliver support services.
Rebecca Mullins here from My Foundation's Youth Housing. I did have my little blue hand up. You must have missed it. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. Hi. Yeah, look, it certainly covered many of the things we're seeing. One of the strange things for us, actually, we only house young people. And on almost every scenario I can see, our tenants' income is going up. So if they were on youth allowance alone, it's doubling. if they were working, they were on youth wages, and now if they're eligible for JobKeeper, they're getting $750 a week, which before they wouldn't have gone anywhere near, except in some, in a few limited examples. However, we are getting a lot of requests for rent reductions. And I think that's got a lot to do with the lag between when people started losing their work and when the support's actually being provided. So as I understand it, the doubling of job seeker isn't until very late this month. JobKeeper doesn't flow to employers until May, and therefore the employer needed cash to be able to roll that out earlier. And if they didn't have that, I think probably there's also great risk in companies receiving JobKeeper and not paying it forward. And I think that's probably a real risk for our young people that aren't potentially able to have, that there's a real power imbalance for them in terms of those conversations with their employers. So I'm kind of wondering what everybody's doing about the lag, because I'm happy to reduce rents, but often their income will be increased and it will be backdated to when they originally lost their rent. And yet there is still a lag for them. So I'm wondering whether people are reducing rents straight away or if they're waiting for new income statements. How is everybody approaching that?
That's a great question. Are there other perspectives from the audience on how that issue is being addressed, that sort of short-term cash management issue, when you know that this problem is short-lived, but it's still very acute for the tenants involved? I mean, I expect, Rebecca, that the way you guys are approaching it is to defer that payment obligation. Is that a fair assumption?
Yes, it is. Mind you, there's risk with that. I mean, when you sign a lease with somebody, it's a legal agreement. You're not supposed to be able to say you don't have to follow this agreement. And you can, I've seen that pulled up in NCAT previously, where someone has said, oh yeah, look, you can pay for your school fees and whatever and pay your rent down the track. And we've actually got in trouble for that at NCAT. So it's a kind of a very grey area. I think it would be accepted during this. But you're actually not supposed to say to somebody, you can stop paying your rent, because they've signed a lease to say that they're going to pay their rent.
Well, that's a good question. So you were mentioning how overall incomes have probably gone up for your tenant cohort at least. But some of that income is, of course, from the job seeker increases.
Yep.
My understanding is, at least in New South Wales, I don't know if I've done sort of the work to sort of work out if this is the case in all states. At least in New South Wales, I know that is not being counted towards assessable income.
That's
so
right.
If a tenant's overall income has gone up, but only because the job seeker increase has sort of compensated for and increased beyond any sort of wage income they've lost, then as a provider you would still be facing perhaps a rent reduction.
Yes. I don't want to make this all about my foundations, but we've got a slightly different portfolio to most. So only a very small proportion of our housing is actually based on the social housing rent model.
Right.
So our exposure to that is about 10% of our entire tenancies. So yes, we will be having to reduce rents, certainly, in that area, but financially it's not as significant a risk for us as it would be for other providers. But in our other portfolios, if they can still afford the rent based on their new income, whether that's reduced or increased, we don't have to make the same exemption for those. It's about just overall household income and working out affordability. It's not actually you have to pay 25% of what's accessible and what's not, if that makes sense. So yeah, we're slightly different in that one. But it's the lag thing that I'm really interested in. Has anybody kind of got any thoughts about that? That lag of when their income changes to the support that they get. So whether people are deferring or whether they're reducing until that point, I'm just not quite sure how to go about it.
If you look at again what all the government advice is on the whole process, they expect you as a landlord to defer that rent, right? They expect that to happen, but not to waive it. So I guess they understand the complexity of tenancy agreements, I guess, but what they're expecting you to do is simply say, I know you can't pay it until this comes in, right? But I expect you to pay it when it does. So let's just keep that accrual in place. So they are expecting you to simply defer. There's a clear message that they don't want to create signals around this is rent free. So yes, they're expecting you simply to defer. And I think, again, that there seem to be hints in some of the communications that they are going to be changing the rules, the actual tenant landlord rules, so that doesn't impact anything. So your comment on it being a legal issue is I think has been picked up by certainly by some of the landlord organisations, and that is feeding its way into government.
Okay. Yeah, I suppose for us the risk is the deferring is all well and good, and we have already on a number of occasions we've deferred, we've offered rent reductions. We're kind of taking a case by case basis rather than a across the board at the moment, although that might change. It's going to be hard to manage. But the issue for us is that none of our housing is long-term social housing. So if people build up big debts in this circumstance, the chances are they walk away and the debt stays. So we may be better off just reducing debt rents across the board, and whiz bang, that makes us eligible for JobKeeper. But is there anything ethical about that? So you know, it's kind of a difficult thing to navigate.
Really interesting point, particularly the interface then with the incentive around JobKeeper and being able to just know that your payroll is going to be underwritten if you take that approach. And it's an issue that you will feel more acutely because of the shorter term nature of your housing, but really is an issue to some extent for all providers, because whether it's long term housing or short term housing, the reality is that any large rental arrears that are built up in this period, tenants do not have the incomes to sort of pay those off easily, and they're likely to have to be forgiven in the sort of
yes,
longer term.
So that's right. So do we forgive them later without the benefit of JobKeeper, or do we forgive them now with the benefit of JobKeeper?
Yeah. You've answered your own question.
Yeah. Yes. I haven't answered the ethics of it. I've answered the financial side of it.
Yeah.
Well,
the continuing to provide your mission is a good way of meeting the ethical side of the.
But I think it also meets the intent of the government rental eviction package, which is we want people to keep paying rent, right? And so if that means reducing rent, then so be it. And they are acutely aware of the problem of people building up large rental arrears only for them to be uncollectible at the end. So again, the message is if you have to reduce rent, do so. So I understand that I wouldn't call it an ethical issue. What you are doing is exercising an option available to you, which meets the targets and the intent of a range of government programs.
I think more broadly, it's worth noting that government is very transparent about the recognition that a lot of these measures are blunt, and there will be some people who are getting more than they need to keep themselves whole for the loss they've sort of faced in this period. Some people that are getting less, and it is intended to be. They're intended to be sweeping measures which prop up the economy as a whole, and that people with more income will be spending, and that will prop up other industries and so forth. So there is a recognition that these aren't perfect policy interventions that have been sort of fine-tuned to every circumstance, and that there will be potentially around the edges these sorts of situations, and that is part of the policy, not an oversight.
All right. Well, thank you for that. I'll try to. I've hogged enough of the question time, so I'll mute myself again now and leave it to others. Thanks for that, both of you.
Thanks, Rebecca. We're sort of drawing to the end of the hour anyway now, but we've probably got time for one more question if there's one out there. Okay, well, look, I think we might leave it there then and wrap up. Once again, thank you very much for your time and for dialing in. We have recorded this session, so we will make the materials and the recording available. We'll liaise with Chia, sort of the best way to get that to you guys. And we'll be sending out a survey as well to get your views on the session and how valuable it was. Thank you very much again for your time, and speak to you soon.
Thanks, guys.